Gaming Bolt presents 15 disappointing games that still received a sequel. Sequels are the bread and butter of the video game industry, but not all long-running series started out with a great game. A lot of them actually began with a rather poor game, and then somehow still managed to get a sequel. Here are 15 bad games that still got sequels. Postal. GTA pushed the boundaries of what games were willing to show, and Postal attempted to push those boundaries even further. The game's only objective was absolute chaos. It didn't matter how offensive or gruesome that chaos was. But it wasn't just the subject matter that made it a bad game. Running through the world and murdering everyone who crossed your path just wasn't fun. Nothing controlled well or looked very good. It was a mediocre game on all fronts. Resident Evil 6. The Resident Evil series practically invented the survival horror genre, but as the series evolved, it moved away from its roots. Resident Evil 5 was more of a cooperative action game than anything else, so the consensus was that the next entry needed to return to true terror. Resident Evil 6 did not manage to do this. Instead, it was another action game that tried to combine the cooperative, over-the-top style with the exploration and tension of the earlier titles in the franchise. The result was a Resident Evil that didn't quite know what it wanted to be. It was clear that for the series to continue, it needed to return to its roots, and that's just what Resident Evil 7 did. But even though the series continued, Resident Evil 6 is still a bad game that doesn't really fit into the series in any way. Two Worlds. Oblivion proved that massive open-world action RPGs could be big sellers. Two Worlds tried to capitalize on this new trend, but couldn't create something as versatile and well-balanced as Bethesda's masterpiece. The world was interesting enough, but actually exploring it was clunky and repetitive. Combat amounted to slowly hitting enemies and trying to fiddle with the controls to survive each encounter. The sequel was a more well-rounded adventure, but the first game was not received very well. Every action you could take was hard to pull off and needlessly complicated. Red Steel. The initial launch of the Wii had many contemplating the potential of motion controls. Red Steel was the game that was meant to show exactly what the new console was capable of. A first-person shooter that mixed gunplay with samurai swords. Pointing at the screen and gunning down mobsters was easy enough, but the swordplay was definitely not one-to-one. Not to mention it also wasn't an incredibly good shooter, just one that managed to work given the Wii's bizarre control scheme. Red Steel 2 was infinitely better, but it completely changed the premise of the game, which certainly helped. Knack. The sequel to Knack hasn't even been released yet, but many were adamant that it received no follow-up. The colorful action platformer may look great and have an interesting premise, but the game itself is a complete and utter bore to play. Jumping over gaps and punching goblins just isn't fun, no matter how you look at it. It appeared to have so much potential that remained untapped. Naughty Bear. The idea of taking control of a murderous teddy bear and tearing the stuffing out of his neighbors was too good to pass up. It was also complicated and difficult. Stealth, combat, and assassinations were all incredibly complex to set up, and most attempts ended in failure or frustration. It received a sequel, but it was also bad, so no retribution for this bear. Kane and Lynch. The unlikely duo of Kane and Lynch seemed like a game that would be great to play through and even better with friends. It was also a lackluster third-person shooter with unlikable characters and just a little too much attitude. Unlike some games on this list, it was not redeemed by its sequel. Killzone. While subsequent games in the Killzone series were all great shooters, the first game failed to establish itself as anything more than unremarkable. While the war with the Helghans was introduced and the world was fleshed out, the shooting itself just wasn't anything special, especially when Microsoft was controlling the market with Halo. Halo Killer, this was not. Red Dead Revolver. Most people don't even remember the first game in the Red Dead series. It's nothing like Red Dead Redemption, so don't get too excited. The two games are only loosely connected, but they both depict a dangerous Western landscape. Revolver just didn't make anyone want to return to the West. Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku. Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku is a top-down action RPG for the Game Boy Advance. The game consists of running around as various characters and punching enemies into submission. There is very little depth and combat lacks variety. It still managed to spawn sequels though. Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed is now one of the biggest franchises in gaming. But the first entry in the series was clunky, repetitive, and visually bland. You were tasked with disposing of a series of targets, but each one was dispatched in an almost identical fashion. Being an assassin felt great in the beginning, but quickly became a bore, especially since the story took the entire length of the game to get going. Bubsy. No Bubsy game is good. That is almost universally agreed upon. But it still got more than one sequel. In an era when creating a hit platforming mascot was the key to success, Bubsy entered the scene with a lot of attitude, awful controls, and terrible level design. His games became infamous, and he still managed to secure a couple more games for himself. Twisted Metal. Twisted Metal is a very cool idea for a game. Attaching guns to cars and pitting them against each other in an arena sounds like a bestseller. And it was, but it took a few games to get the mechanics ironed out. Until then, it was just a game where players drove cars at each other and prayed that they managed to hit something. Street Fighter. Street Fighter may be one of the best known fighting games in the world right now, but it didn't happen until the release of Street Fighter 2. The first game was still figuring out what made a good fighting game and never really found that something special. It wasn't until Street Fighter 2 introduced combos that the genre really took off. Grand Theft Auto. The first two GTA games were top-down shooters that still covered incredibly mature themes, but they did little to differentiate themselves, especially the first game. Players would run around gunning down cops and then desperately trying to flee. It was a little more than a fancy version of Cops and Robbers that happened to spawn one of the greatest franchises in gaming history.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.